From 1998 to 2010, a nameless practice learned to subtract the ordinary, hold steady under ambiguity, and turn errors into a method for contact. Before we begin, write in the comments where you're watching from and what you believe about extraterrestrial contact. By late 1998, the practice did not have a name, a map, or a plan, only a handful of people scattered across distant towns, willing to trade warm evenings for cold horizons and the long, uncertain work of attention. They carried notebooks, thermoses, and the kind of courage that looks like patience instead of bravado. No one expected revelations. The point even then was to discover whether human nerves could stay steady when the familiar loosened its grip. The earliest nights read like laboratory notes from a school that had not yet learned its subject. Timestamps written in shaky hands, confused arrows pointing to stars, and a neat column labeled ordinary explanations that swallowed most of what anyone thought they saw. Mistakes arrived first, as teachers. A bright planet hugged the horizon in November 1998 and seemed to follow a dirt road as observers shifted in their chairs. Only later did they learn how parallax tricks a tired brain. A helicopter on approach in 1999 looked like a hovering orb, until rotor wash reached the ears 5 breath holds later. Meteor showers wrote smooth arcs that dazzled newcomers and humbled veterans who had warned against drama. The night sky, it turned out, would break every romantic shortcut the mind might try. So the circles stopped looking for shortcuts and began building a craft. By 2000, the first protocols were quietly taking shape. Pre-briefs focused on subtraction. Rule out the ordinary so the extraordinary, if it arrived, would have a clean frame. Someone started carrying a folded schedule of predictable satellite trains. Another created a tiny checklist of aircraft signatures. Strobes that blink, paths that slide, the lazy feel of approach versus the needle-sharp angles that never quite make sense. Headings were taught with outstretched arms and a compass that had lost its shine. People learned to keep pens warm so ink would flow when adrenaline froze fingers. Above all, they learned to write before they spoke because adrenaline loves a microphone and memory does not. Silence itself became a tool. The circles learned the difference between the quiet of weather and the hush that arrived like a decision. In summer 2001, several logs from different regions noted the same sequence within days. Insects dimmed to nothing. A bone-deep hum pressed at the edge of hearing, and a single point brightened along the horizon without any arc of approach. The point held steady against wind for long breaths, then faded as if brightness had folded inward instead of traveling away. No one called this proof. They called it pattern, and patterns were good enough to train with. Anonymity grew out of necessity, not mystique. Early attempts to share publicly attracted the wrong attention. Spectacle chasers, improvisers, and those who wanted to buy the unknown by buying gear. In response, the circles subtracted everything that could distract. No rosters, no maps, no coordinates, no names. What remained were habits that anyone could inherit. Arrive on time, help carry blankets, slow the breath together, hold a wide, soft gaze that includes the periphery, and write the bare facts. Authority, such as it was, meant the capacity to distribute authority. If you could teach 3 people to do what you could do, you were already stepping back. Dreams, at first, were almost an embarrassment to mention. The early logs from 2000 and 2001 record them in cramped handwriting along margins. Circular place, light with no source, symbols underfoot. When people admitted they were having the same structures across distance, the circles did not build myth. They built method. Write before you speak, sleep again before you analyze, compare scaffolding, sequence of spaces, posture taught, quality of light, rather than adjectives. The point was never to make doctrine. It was to notice repeats without inventing reasons for them. The equipment list in those years looked stubbornly ordinary. Paper notebooks, pencils that worked when pens would not, red-filtered flashlights to protect night vision, thermoses, layers of clothing, and a willingness to sit with nothing. Ordinary gear protected the ethic. If the method depends on expense or heroics, it collapses the moment it multiplies. The practice needed to be passable hand to hand, like a recipe, not a franchise. By the end of 2001, the practice had survived its most important trial. It had learned to keep going when nothing happened. Whole nights passed in clean, uneventful attention, and those nights built stamina the way long walks build a heart. People discovered they liked one another in silence. They learned to laugh softly at their own habits, how adrenaline wanted to sprint ahead of perception, how the jaw clenched when surprise passed through, how the mind begged for closure it had not earned. The sky had not opened, but something else had, a culture small enough to be invisible and sturdy enough to last. From 2002 through 2005, the practice moved from survival to structure. The circles learned how to begin, how to persist, and, equally important, how to end. Pre-briefs adopted a predictable cadence, a weather scan, a quick review of aircraft corridors, a check of satellite passes printed earlier that day, a reminder to drink water before adrenaline arrived, and a short shared breath pattern to synchronize the group. Post-briefs added care. Water first, food second, words third. Everyone agreed to write for 2 minutes before anyone spoke. Not to muzzle stories, but to protect memory from being sculpted by the loudest voice. Fieldcraft improved by making error into curriculum. A lens flare in early 2002 fooled a confident group for 10 minutes. A week later, those same people ran an optics workshop in someone's living room, learning how reflections bloom when an angle meets a reflective surface just so. In 2003, a slow plane facing the circle mimicked a hovering point until its runway lights finally betrayed the trick. They added a line to the checklist that night. Always imagine you are looking down the barrel of something ordinary. In 2004, a string of high-altitude satellites imitated intention and taught the group to watch for the telltale glide. In 2005, fog in a distant valley turned car headlights into floating orbs. The embarrassment became a study in microclimate. The circles learned that competence grows best in unglamorous places. Someone kept a shoebox of small supplies, spare pencils, batteries, red film, cheap compasses that could be given away without ceremony. Someone else maintained a binder of printed overpass schedules because phones were unreliable and, more importantly, because looking up trains on a glowing screen in the field narrowed attention at the precise moment it needed to stay wide. Ordinary tools kept the body humble and the field of view honest. A subtle shift arrived in spring 2003. Independent logs from far-flung regions captured. Sequences that rhymed so precisely they felt choreographed. Hush, bone tone, emergence at a similar elevation, a triangle that held longer than wind should allow, a slow collapse into a single brightness and a dimming that behaved like light folding inward. Times, once chaotic, began to cluster within narrow windows. Headings, once all over the compass, began to congregate within ranges that made sense given vantage. No one claimed a revelation. People simply noticed the pattern and tightened their craft. Dreams, too, adopted a clearer grammar. Logs from 2002 through 2005 include sketches of curved spaces with no visible light source, notes about a posture lesson that emphasized soft jaws and long exhales, and sequences of symbols that pulsed like chords. The presences in these dreams did not deliver prophecies. They delivered corrections. Participants woke less frightened and more capable, as if an overnight rehearsal had tuned an instrument the body already owned. Anonymity went from guideline to guardrail. Early in 2004, a well-meaning enthusiast proposed public coordinates and weekly announcements. The idea evaporated after a single trial attracted clamor and narrow attention that made wide perception impossible. The circles reaffirmed their hygiene. No names, no maps, no sites, no rosters, no heroes. Authority meant you could distribute authority. Leadership meant you could teach others to leave you behind. In these years, newcomers arrived with questions the veterans had learned to love. What are we looking for? The answer was a subtraction. First, everything that can be predicted. What counts as a signature? The answer was a behavior. Holds against wind, dimming without shrinkage, geometries too clean for drift. What if we are wrong? The answer was a practice. Write, compare, and let the dull questions win. Did we synchronize clocks, log fatigue, cross-check traffic? If the unknown respects anything, the circles decided, it respects steadiness. One night in late 2005 has since become a lesson plan. The sky was cloudless, the air cold enough to keep minds alert, and the horizon clean. The hush came first. Insects dimmed as if a hand had adjusted a dial. A low tone pressed at the edge of hearing. A point brightened low held its place and was joined by two others that locked into an equilateral triangle. For several long minutes, the geometry hovered with such economy that conversation would have been an insult. The group breathed, wrote, and waited. Finally, the triangle folded into one, dimmed without retreat, and left the field exactly as it had found it. Silent, steady, and somehow wider than before. The debrief was unremarkable in the best way. Times aligned within seconds. Headings differed only by vantage. Sensation logs overlapped without echo. Dull questions were asked and answered. Confidence rose not because something dramatic had occurred, but because competence had held when it mattered. Throughout 2002-2005, the circles also practiced kindness as deliberately as headings. People brought blankets for strangers, extra thermoses for those who forgot, and the patience to let quiet voices finish before confident ones began. They learned that composure in groups can be rehearsed, that gentleness protects attention, and that laughter helps memory remember its place. The practice was building more than a method. It was building a way to be human together under pressure. And you? Have you ever noticed that calmness changes what unfolds? On a night drive, in a tense conversation, or under a sky you do not understand? Tell us in the comments where you felt the shift and what you did with it. Between 2006 and 2008, the practice matured from sturdy to supple. The circles did not just survive long, quiet nights. They learned to shape attention like a lens that can widen or narrow without breaking. Guides emerged who refused any hint of spotlight. Their authority showed up in small acts. The way they modeled a soft jaw when surprise tightened the group. The way they returned a conversation to description when theory tried to take over. The way they handed a notebook to a newcomer and asked them to read the time aloud so that comparison would have a spine. Field methods became elegant in their simplicity. People rehearsed two kinds of seeing: a wide, soft gaze that held the whole dome at once, and a micro-precise focus that could drop onto a single point without collapsing peripheral awareness. They practiced what to do when adrenaline sprinted: a deliberate lengthening of the exhale, a conscious softening of the shoulders, a reminder to feel the ground under both feet. They learned to remain seated for 5 minutes after a disappearance, so that memory could settle before speech sculpted it. Those 5 minutes, veterans said, were the cheapest way to buy accuracy. Error continued to be the most generous teacher. In early 2006, a drone, rare at the time, hovered with uncanny steadiness over a distant tree line. The group, primed by months of subtle signatures, nearly gave it credence until a thin mechanical whine betrayed the trick. The next week, that failure became a module, cataloged the sounds of the ordinary. Over months, a pocket sound library grew on small recorders, labeled with unromantic names like rotor, tailwind, and approach runway lights. Likewise, an optics night in 2007 taught observers how lenses behave when moisture rides the air, how halos bloom, and how distant car lights lift off. Invisible ridges when a temperature inversion holds. The first deliberate resonance experiments began quietly in 2006. Separate circles agreed to hold the same posture and breath for 1 minute at an exact time. No one demanded a result. Yet logs compared weeks later showed a soft clustering of appearances. A point brightened here, a triangle formed there, a beam touched ground briefly somewhere else, all within narrow windows. The data did not settle any arguments, but it did teach an ethic: practice coherence together and see what the world does with it. If nothing happened, people still grew more patient. If something happened, comparison had a place to land. Dreams became less shy. Across 2006-2008, structures repeated with near mechanical consistency. Circular spaces without visible light sources, symbols that acted like notation rather than language, and presences that taught posture more than prophecy. Participants described being encouraged, without words, to let the tongue rest high so the jaw would stop clamping, to feel weight in the feet when light grew bright, and to keep the exhale long precisely where fear wanted it short. People woke calmer than they went to bed. They went about their workdays with an unearned steadiness that, over time, became earned. Families began to show up in larger numbers. Parents taught children short intervals of stillness as a game. 90 seconds of quiet watching, then a walk, then 90 more. The point was not belief, it was attention. Children learned to name clouds without romance, to recognize how stars drift across hours, and to write what they saw before asking what it meant. The side effects were domestic and beautiful: calmer bedtimes, shorter arguments, and the surprising discovery that describing the sky without embellishment also helps a child describe their feelings without panic. The ethic of anonymity held, not as secrecy, but as hygiene. Without names, there were no heroes to follow and no villains to fight. Without maps, there were no shrines to trample. Without rosters, there were no headlines to chase. This lightness kept the practice passable hand to hand. A person could move away and seed a new circle, with nothing more than memory of the method and a willingness to meet strangers under a sky no one owned. A night from mid-2007 shows how supple the culture had become. The hush arrived like an invisible tide. The insect's sound went thin and then vanished. A low tone thrummed in ribs. A point brightened along the horizon and held so still that even skeptics felt their stomachs drop. Two more joined it. The triangle hovered without drift, then, with a softness that made the group think of hands being folded, collapsed into one and dimmed as if a shade had been lowered. No one rushed in with meanings. The group breathed, wrote, and allowed 5 minutes of clean quiet. The debrief that followed was patient. Times aligned within seconds. Headings differed by expected degrees, and sensation logs overlapped without echo. The story they left with was not a story. It was a pattern written in ordinary words by ordinary people who had practiced how to stay ordinary. Auditing matured as well. Rotating teams collated anonymized entries and compared them against satellite schedules and traffic corridors. They flagged drift toward drama, questioned timelines, and praised entries that stayed clear even when nothing happened. The purpose was not to police, but to keep the frame clean. By the end of 2008, the circles recognized that they had crossed from improvisation into culture. They knew how to train newcomers without scaring them or selling them hope. They knew how to protect gentleness so courage would not burn out. They knew how to convert embarrassment into curriculum. They had learned, in other words, how to be a species of instrument together. Quick pause. Does this patient, collaborative way of meeting the unknown resonate with you? Leave a comment and follow so these stories reach people who value rigor as much as wonder. Have you noticed a small discipline, like writing before speaking, changing an entire experience? From 2009 through 2010, the circles stepped into a quiet culmination. A decade of subtraction had cleared space in which subtle patterns could stand without being jostled by hope. The method no longer felt experimental. It felt lived in, like a well-used path through grass that continues even when no one is walking it. People arrived with less chatter, carried fewer expectations, and left with cleaner notes. The sky had not changed much. The people had field nights took on a calm orchestration. Pre-briefs were brief because muscle memory held the rest. Weather, corridors, trains, breath. A shared silence settled like a cloth. The group widened attention to include the periphery and resisted the urge to narrate the first oddity that tugged at focus. When nothing happened, the practice felt as legitimate as when something did. When something happened, the practice felt ready. The signatures that had trained the network for years showed up with a steadiness that many found moving precisely because it lacked flair. A hush emptied the insect chorus. A hum pressed at the edge of hearing. Warmth swept forearms on cold nights. A metallic tang touched the tongue for a heartbeat and was gone. A point brightened low, then a second, then a third. Geometry locked. Wind insisted. The lights declined to respond. Minutes held. The fold into one arrived without fuss. Dimming behaved like brightness lowering behind opaque glass. To the untrained eye, it was another night under a big sky. To the circles, it was a sentence in a language they had spent 10 years learning to read. The year 2009 brought small experiments and distributed attention. Without public schedules, circles in different regions chose the same minute to breathe in a simple pattern and rest eyes in wide, soft gaze. Logs compared weeks later found that some nights carried a surprising coherence. Appearances clustered within narrow windows, as if an unseen conductor had been tapping a baton across distance. No one declared causation. People simply wrote the data, drew a thin line under it, and kept practicing. Dreams exhibited a similar austerity. The grandeur of earlier years gave way to drills that felt almost practical. Participants described being guided to keep a long exhale exactly when a flash of brightness tried to steal it, to let the tongue rest so the jaw would not, to feel weight in the feet when a presence moved closer. The presences did not lecture. They coached. People woke with the peculiar relief that follows competence. Not triumph, not proof, but readiness. Auditing reached a rhythm that felt like hygiene rather than judgment. Anonymized logs were collated by rotating teams and checked against predictable events. If an entry drifted toward story, a note asked for plainer words. If times did not line up, Someone asked dull questions until they did. Failures were folded into modules that the next newcomers would inherit, sparing them from rerunning the same mistakes. The practice had built a memory without becoming a monument. Anonymity proved its worth in these years. There were no heroes to corrupt the ethic with personal arcs, no sites to overrun, no calendars to attract clamor. Because there was nothing to sell, there was little to buy. The work traveled by conversation and kindness. A person could move away and, in a new place, put down a thermos, a notebook and a red light, and find that the practice arrived with them like a language they had not realized they spoke. One night near the turn into 2010 offered a summary of the era. Cold air, sharp stars, clean horizons. The hush first, then the hum, then a brightening point. Two more joined and settled into a triangle that ignored wind as if wind were only a rumor. No one moved for devices in the first minute. Breath lengthened. Pens scratched. After long, unmoving minutes, the triangle folded. The single point dimmed and the insects remembered their work. In debrief, the group compared times that matched within seconds, headings that differed by expectancy, and sensation logs that overlapped like tracing paper. The event did not prove anything. It did something better. It demonstrated that human beings could remain lucid together when the frame wobbled. By late 2010, the circles understood what their first decade had built. They had trained a posture, wide attention, soft jaw, long breath, honest notes, patient comparisons, and care for one another before conclusions. They had discovered that courage is often gentle. They had learned that error is a gift if you let it teach. They had found that the unknown, whatever its nature, seems to reward steadiness and starve spectacle. Proof, they concluded, is brittle. It snaps under the weight of expectation. Capacity endures. It grows under repetition the way muscle does. The decade closed without fanfare and with a strong undercurrent of confidence. The circles did not have answers, but they had a way to behave in their absence. They stepped into the 2010s carrying something better than certainty, a culture capable of meeting the unfamiliar without breaking it or themselves. The sky would do what the sky would do. The people would keep arriving early, breathing, watching, writing, comparing, caring, and going home, and they would return, not because they had been promised anything, but because practice had become a form of belonging. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who are also fascinated by UFOs. And leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think really happened?